Right, thank you all. Thanks. Thank you all for coming, and thank Thomas Harding for coming this evening as well too. Otherwise, you'd just be listening to me, which some of you might find interesting or not. But we're here to talk about his new book, White Debt, and of course his previous as well too, as and when. And I thought we'd start, if Thomas wouldn't mind, with him reading a little bit from the book, and then we can get into talking about it.
Hi everybody, great to see you all. It's nice to be in a bookshop after so long after COVID. It's terrific, and what a beautiful day. Don't know if you got out for a walk. I had a lovely walk today. I don't live far away, I live in Hampshire, just near Petersfield, so it's not very far. So I'm looking forward to our chat. Let me see what we got here. All right, let me just read the beginning. Why not? It's a good place to start. All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
No, I'm moving forward for that reason.
Okay. Maybe I need to speak louder. Can you hear me at the back? Okay.
I can, but a little more volume would be...
More volume.
Yes.
More volume coming your way.
Thank you.
If there's too much volume.
That's okay, I can put my hand on my ears if necessary.
Okay, here we go. This is the prologue from the beginning of the book. The Vendu office was located off the main street in Georgetown, the capital of Demerara. It was an immense two-story stone building that had been built by the Dutch when they ran the colony. Today was auction day, and around its entrance milled a large crowd of black, white, and mixed race people. Some were customers on their way inside. Others were hawkers and street peddlers trying to make a few guilders in the hubbub. Still more were simply curious, with little else to do on this balmy tropical spring morning than sit on a wall and watch what was going on. It was easy to find the sale. All one had to do was follow the noise. A great heaving cacophony of auctioneer babble, shouted bids, and, for those victorious, raucous cheering. There was also, if you listened hard, cries of anguish and fear, but these were easily lost in the hullabaloo. Through the two large wooden doors and along a shadowed passageway was an expansive inner courtyard crowded with buyers and sellers, their agents and lawyers. For this was an auction of enslaved people, where men, women and children were sold and bought, where money changed hands in return for human property. Up on a platform stood a man with black skin, nearly naked, except for a cloth cast about his loins. Half a dozen white men were examining his torso and limbs. A few steps back, standing in a semicircle, were another 50 pink-faced men. Some were dressed in linen suits, others in cotton trousers and jackets. Most wore Panama or other straw hats to keep the blazing sun off their fragile heads. To lighten the atmosphere, ham sandwiches were handed out, along with glasses of rum or sangria, a strong liqueur made from brandy and nutmeg. On one side of the platform stood the auctioneer, hammer in hand. Capital slave, gentleman, named Joe. Good carpenter, age 28, he yelled. Oh, you needn't look there, hasn't had the whip often. Now who bids? The auctioneer now looked at the enslaved man. Walk about you and show yourself. After a brief flurry of hands, Joe was purchased for 600 guilders. A woman and her 3 children were next. Here's a good lot, gentlemen. Capital washer, Polly, shouted the auctioneer to the crowd. Stand up, girl. Show your legs. Let people see what you're made of. The crowd laughed, and the auctioneer continued. 3 handy boys, gentlemen, must be sold with the other 6. 8 and 10. Grow bigger and better every day. We'll make capital fellows by and by. Look smart, you young rascals. You, Sam, mind yourself. If you look sulky, you'll catch a lick. Come, gentlemen, we can't wait. What do you say? Knock 'em off. There's plenty more to come. This lot went for 1,000 guilders. For the enslaved men and women being sold at the Vendu was brutalizing, terrifying, humiliating, heartbreaking. It meant a lifetime of servitude, unrelenting years in which they would have to perform back-breaking work and receive punishment for even the smallest of transgressions. For the slaveholders and the people who supported them, it meant profit and luxury and power. In other words, business as usual.
Thank you for that. That's obviously gives you a sense, in a visual sense, of what went on, and that in many other places in the Caribbean and in North America and such. And the book obviously goes on from that to detail that. Many of your books, well, for instance, Hans and Rudolph and The House by the Lake and the Legacy, which is about the Lion's Tea Room, look at history through the lens of family connection and memoir. Something I think, I don't know if it exactly started, but Edmond Duval's Hair with the Amber Eyes certainly sort of kicked off that a bit. So they sort of fall a bit into that way of presenting history. So with that in mind, it was interesting to know what was the genesis of White Debt, where this comes into, given your previous.
Well, my previous books, I mean, I write books, and my previous books have been, Hans and Rudolph was about my great uncle who tracked down the commandant of Auschwitz. He was German Jewish. My father's family are German Jewish. We left Germany in the 1930s. House by the Lake is in the same kind of family. It's about this house that my family built, a very small house outside of Berlin. And it's the story of my family falling in love with this little house and then it being taken from us, and then another family moving there, and then it being taken from them, and another family moving in and that being taken from them. And it's a way of telling the history of Germany through this little house, but also of Europe. So for example, the Berlin Wall was built through the garden. So this house by the lake was no longer, you couldn't get to the lake because the Berlin Wall was in between. So you get the picture. Then this one over here, this Legacy, is about my mother's family, and her family created the catering firm J. Lyons. If you remember J. Lyons, the corner houses, the tea rooms. So it's a history of J. Lyons and the history of Britain told through this one family and the companies. But also, while I was researching it, I knew about J. Lyons. I didn't know that before that my family had a tobacco company, a really big tobacco company in the 19th century. It was called Salmon and Gluckstein. It was the biggest tobacco retailer in Britain. Karl Marx used to buy his cigars. Their marketing slogan was smoke more, pay less. Smoke more, pay less, which would hardly work today. But when I was researching that, I kind of was thinking about the timing. And if you were buying large amounts of tobacco in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, almost certainly the tobacco was being imported from North America. And if it came from North America, almost certainly it came from plantations worked by enslaved people. I'm like, oh, okay, that's quite big news. And so for all these years, our family have thought of themselves very much as the victims. And the shoe was very much on the other foot. And so I started thinking about what I knew about slavery. And, you know, I don't know about you, but when I was at school, I was taught that we were the good guys. We abolished slavery. You know, William Wilberforce, the abolition of slavery. Something vaguely about this triangle movement of goods and slaves, but that was about it. I knew much more about North America. I'd seen Gone with the Wind and Django Unchained and, you know, 12 Years a Slave, the Southern Plantations. I was more familiar with that. And I realized very quickly how little I knew about Britain and slavery. And so I thought maybe I should learn. So I started reading. It's about 2 or 3 years ago. And to my embarrassment, I realized how little I knew. And one of the things I became very quickly aware of is how little I knew about Britain and the Caribbean. I really knew almost nothing about Britain's role in the Caribbean. And so I started reading about that. And I started thinking maybe I should write something about this. And I like writing history through people. How does history affect people? How do people affect history? And narrative non-fiction. So I'm very interested in detail. What kind of shoes do people wear? What kind of music do they listen to? What do they eat? What does the land look like where they live? How does the land change, the habitat change during their lifetimes? And what do they say to each other? And to be true non-fiction, narrative non-fiction, you need an enormous amount of source material. You can't make it up. That's called fiction. So, or historical fiction, which is great, but that's not what I do, not in these books. And so I needed a story. I was looking for a story where I had an enormous amount of source material. And I was thinking maybe it'd be interesting, maybe through a slave rebellion, that'd be interesting from the point of view. So I very much wanted to include the voices of enslaved people. And I was looking, and then I came across this uprising in Demerara. And the extraordinary thing about the uprising in Demerara, which is what we're going to talk about today, is all the material which was captured at the time. So after the uprising, there were these court-martials, these trials, and we have the testimony from those trials. Hundreds and hundreds of pages, both of the white people talking about what happened, but also of the enslaved people, recounting what happened, saying what they said. There's reported speech, lots of reported speech. I'm like, yeah, that's great. Lots of reported speech. There's memoirs and letters. There's newspaper articles. There's parliamentary debates. I mean, there's so much stuff about this one uprising, which I'd never heard of. And I was like, okay, that's the one I'm going to do.
I think it's interesting to say too that when you say Demerara, we all think of a particular type of sugar. And the reason it's called Demerara sugar is that it came from this area on the Caribbean coast of South America, which is now Guyana. But it was, the time was called, or at least part of it was called Demerara. And the sugar, that sort of brown sugar came synonymous for some.
So just to locate you, if you think of where Venezuela is, on the north coast of South America, and you go east, that's Guyana. So just above Brazil, on the North Atlantic coast of South America, and they still speak English. It's the only country in South America they speak English. It used to be called British Guiana, if you're trying to put it all together.
Is it Belize? Anyway.
Belize is in Central
It's
America.
Central America, isn't it? It's up above Panama. That's right. But it's so so it is a family connection that brought you through to this story, though there isn't
Tangential.
a direct family
Yeah.
connection to a plantation or
Yeah,
such.
so I wanted to really think about Britain's role in the slavery within the lens of what does it mean to my family, and what does, as somebody who's benefited directly from slavery, I wanted to understand more about Britain's role in slavery, and then also what does it mean today? So what's the legacy today? So the book is partly the history of this uprising told through 4 characters, but I interweave an investigation into what does slavery mean today, what does the legacy mean, and what should we do, if anything, about it?
Oh, we should say, if you hadn't mentioned that this uprising took place in 1823, just to give the time frame.
Almost 200 years ago.
True. And it's been interesting, we'll talk about in a moment just how much has and hasn't changed in 200 years. But it's when saying about interweaving, is I noticed the way that you've structured this is you have your historical narrative of the events, recreating the events, which I think you do brilliantly. I think you really feel you're there witnessing the events. And interspersed in between the chapters of that, you have, and in italic as opposed to in Roman, contemporary sections where you're talking about your own experiences going to Guyana and your research into this and thoughts on the subject. They're sort of interleaved, and as opposed to, I mean, obviously you have a preamble there where you create the slave market, and then there's a summation, but instead of doing it forward and afterwards, you have that worked through the book, which I suppose was to reinforce the fact that these things still have bearing today, which we'll talk about. And actually, speaking of that, I mean, thinking about the bearing they have on today, I couldn't help but reading this, thinking about how much kickback there is at the moment about addressing these concerns about the legacy of slavery in this country and certainly in the United States. There's been lately seems to be quite a bit of kicking back about that and empire and a lot of other things. And I was just wondering, you know, how much of that you're feeling, whether you're getting anything back about that, or just whether that's surprising to you or not.
Yeah, so what's been really wonderful for me has been the support I've had from especially people in Guyana. So I've had really great, and it feels like a team effort. So so when I started researching the story, it became very obvious that I wasn't the first to this history, and there are plenty of Guyanese and Caribbean historians who've looked at this story. And so I was very much standing on their shoulders, and it was important to me as part of the project is to include and recognize those voices. So when I was in Guyana, one of the things that people said to me is, are you going to come here and take this story and make some money out of it? You know, and we've had plenty of that before. And I was like, well, actually, part of what I'm trying to do is to recognize what's happened in the past and to learn. And so actually, one of the benefits of having these interwoven structures, I could include their voices and name them and talk about what they've done in the past. But there has been a bit of kickback, so that some of the newspapers have, you know, not been happy with. They were very happy with the book. They said it was a page turner, and they loved the meticulous research. But they said I was wallowing in guilt. You know, so it's very much a political. They took a political view on it, which I thought was interesting. They didn't criticize the writing or the story, but
well, probably being made to feel uncomfortable about it.
You know, if that's what it takes, I'm okay with that, and I understand. You know, I can deal with that. You know, it's not a problem.
Well, I mean, it's playing out. It was just in the news today that Prince William
Right.
Cater in Jamaica,
Yeah.
and were confronted with this very issue
Yeah.
there about reparations in the sense
Yeah.
which we actually can talk a little bit
Yeah.
because that's one of those flashpoint words. As soon as you say reparations and people start putting pound or dollar signs
Yeah.
on things, but not necessarily mean that.
So before we get to all that, should we talk about what the story happens in the story?
Oh, is that okay? Sorry,
Should
am
we share that?
am I jumping ahead? Please, I you would be better placed to.
No, that's okay.
the
Well, let me
outline.
just give you a structure of the story before we get into the kind of the today, because the today stuff's really interesting, and I want to get to it. So, 1823, 200 years ago, Guyana. There's about 70,000 enslaved people. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 white colonists and free black people, men and women. There's really an unknown number of indigenous people. We don't know. Could be 5, 10, 20,000. We don't know. And 1823 is an interesting year. So when I started looking into this, I knew about the end of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. That was 1807. But that vendu I read earlier happened in 1823. How's that even possible? How could they be selling and buying human property so many years after the end of the Atlantic slave trade? It took me a long time to work that out. And it turns out that what they did is they literally cancelled the Atlantic slave trade. They didn't stop slavery. I didn't realize that. So they no longer were the British kidnapping and transporting enslaved men and women and children from Africa to the Americas. And by the way, by that stage, they transported over 3 million people, of which at least a third died. So we're talking about 1 million people dying by the Brits. Just remember that number. It's shocking. 1807, they stopped the Atlantic slave trade, but they didn't actually abolish slavery in the empire until 1833. So between those two dates, people who owned enslaved people could take them from Jamaica, transport them to Demerara, because it's between the colonies, it's allowed, and then take them to auction. Remarkable. So all that time that was still going on. So that's the context, and there was a kind of a number of people in Britain who are agitating for the end of slavery. There'd been a very big upsurge of popular campaigning around 1807, then it kind of dipped because people felt, okay, we've solved it. And there was a small number of people who were agitating. A lot of people in the church, Unitarians, and both white and black, not just white, in Britain. And there was a lot of pressure on the politicians. And so, as a compromise, because the slave owners, the people who had the traders, they didn't want to stop slavery because they relied on the enslaved people. So they came up with a compromise, which was to ameliorate. They had this strange word. They were going to ameliorate the conditions of slavery, which basically meant slavery could keep going, but women could no longer be whipped, and enslaved people could attend church on Sundays. That was kind of the compromise. And a letter was sent by the Secretary of State to all the governors in the Caribbean. You need to implement this amelioration of slavery. And this letter came to the governor of Demerara, and he knew that his court of policy, it was like the local council, would not like it. So he delayed and delayed and delayed trying to do it. This is 1823, in the summer of 1823. But despite his efforts, word got out to the general population, first to the people working with him, then to the colonists, then to the enslaved people, that slavery was coming to an end. And there was this great expectation and excitement, but nothing happened. And so in the August of 1823, Jack Gladstone, who was an enslaved cooper, he made barrels on this one estate called Success. Jack Gladstone and his associates got together and they said, okay, we're going to force this freedom of slavery. And so I tell the story through these four people. One is Jack Gladstone, who was 28 years old. He lived on Success. Two is John Gladstone. Yes, there is a reason they both have the same last name. John Gladstone, who owned the estate of Success. So what typically happened is that the enslaved men and women, they would be given the last names of the person who owned the estate, the plantation. John Gladstone was one of the wealthiest estate owners. He owned 7 estates in Demerara. Over 2,000 men and women and children were registered to his name. He was a very wealthy trader based in Liverpool. He was head of the West Indian Trade Association. He was also father to the future Prime Minister, William Gladstone. And William Gladstone inherited a lot of money from his father. So when people talk about William Gladstone being this great liberal Prime Minister, they tend to forget that he inherited all this money. And also, in his first debate in Parliament, he stood up and defended his father's slavery. So that's the second character. The third character is a guy called John Smith. John Smith is this white missionary who came from Britain, from Gosport, very near here, and near Portsmouth. And he and his wife Jane ended up in Demerara. And remarkably, he kept a diary of his time in Demerara. And it's not just like I had this for breakfast and, I went to see Bob for dinner. It is 60,000 words. It's a lot of words. And he described things in extraordinarily colourful detail. And he was a great opponent of slavery. And he built up this mission. They had about 2,000 people who were part of the congregation. And he taught enslaved people how to read and write. And then he was accused of fomenting the uprising. And in the trials after the uprising, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. And then his story became a cause célèbre in Britain, because people could relate to him. He was a white person, the general public, most women white, could relate to him. And so he became a cause célèbre, and he was seen as a martyr, because he ended up dying in prison before he heard that his sentence was commuted by the king. So he was seen as a martyr. And the fourth person is a guy called John Cheveley. There's a lot of Johns. John Cheveley, and he was a store clerk. He came to Demerara because his family had run out of money. So he was looking for work. He went all the way over. And that happens a lot in the colonies. And so we get to see his story, and he joined the British militia, and we get to see the suppression of the uprising through this guy whose views change throughout the book. Without giving you too much away, he starts as very much for slavery, and by the end of the book, he's much less sympathetic. So you get to see his kind of transformation through his experience. So those are the 4 characters. And the book is split into 3 parts. The first part is the arrival, when all these people come to Demerara. The second part is the uprising. And the third part is the trial, where all this thing comes to a head.
I think it's very, well, you would know, very succinct outline. Still worth reading the book, because Tom's done a brilliant job of making all of this come alive. on the page, and it reads like a novel. It does read like a novel. It has that kind of narrative drive to it, and you want to find out then what happens and so forth. And the characters are really drawn in depth and very real. But again, it keeps referring back to the fact that this has a bearing on today.
Yeah.
And it's something that just in the last few years has really come to the fore. I mean, it's just recently now, thing you were saying about Gladstone and how wealthy he was, that the National Trust is now, being more forthcoming in a lot of the
Sure.
properties that they run, just where the money came to have these grand houses filled with these wonderful, beautiful things. And most of those houses in this country in the 18th, well, starting in the 17th century really, but 18th century into the 19th century, were on sugar.
Yeah.
And some of them were on cotton, which of course has its own direction, but a lot of it was on the sugar trade. It was an immense amount of money generated by sugar, and all of it was on slave labor.
Yeah.
And that's and of course, things that have happened recently in Bristol and things like that, and people, just now saying, why are we celebrating these men who basically made fortunes on owning other people.
Mm.
So anyway, this gets back again to there's a sort of bit of resistance to bringing that to the fore.
Well, when I was in Guyana, I mean, people would say to me, I would ask them, what's the legacy? Does it affect you today? And I mean, first of all, you could see it in the street names in Guyana, in the regions, in the names of the plantations. They still have the names of the plantations. And they said, absolutely, the legacy of slavery is passed down the generations. You see it in the different health outcomes, the education outcomes, the wealth ownership. And that was consistent whenever I spoke to someone. And when I was thinking more and more about this atrocity that was slavery for hundreds of years, not just a few years, hundreds of years, and Britain was very much at the centre of it, it becomes overwhelming. I mean, I found it quite overwhelming just how big this terrible thing was. And then I started thinking to myself, okay, who's to blame? Harm has been done, who is to blame? And I became very uncomfortable when I started thinking about that, because it became pretty obvious who's to blame, and that's white people. And I'm someone who never used to even say I was white on the census. I felt, how dare you label me, and it's none of your business, and I'm not someone who's ever really looked at that. And the more I thought about it, it became more and more clear. The vast majority of those engaged with the kidnap and transport of Africans were white. They owned the boats, the soldiers, the sailors were white. The vast majority of people who owned the estates, the plantations, the managers, the supervisors, the people who ran the ships that brought the commodities back to Britain were white. The vast majority of people who then made money from those enterprises, including my family, were white. Now, that's not to say there weren't some black and mixed race people involved. The president of Benin and Ghana have apologized for their role in slavery. Yes, some of the sailors were black. Yes, a very small number of the slave owners were black. That's true, but the vast, vast majority of people were white. And so that took me to this place where I started thinking about, this debt that was owed, that white people owed.
It's funny, because if you flip that on its head, because it's saying, well, it's the white population is doing it, and they were doing it because the people they were enslaving looked different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you think it wasn't? We can have questions in a second.
Go for
Sorry.
it.
That's very interesting. It's quite controversial, I find, the topic of
Yeah.
slavery, because the thing is, where do you start? Because I know whites did the most of it, but let's say at the moment, yes, we should apologise, but I think Libya and Arab countries should also apologise, because they have been influenced by white supremacy. They're involved in it as well, and it's quite controversial, because in Africa and Sudan, there is still sort of, you know, slavery going on, and that's not to whitewash anything, because, you know, it is terrible, and there should be an apology for it. But the thing is, if you're saying white people to, you know, today, can they, you know, change what happened in the past? A bit like with the Germans who feel very terrible about, you know, the Holocaust, because they think, gosh, this is our history. So it's quite controversial.
So you're saying there's a lot of blame to be spread around?
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
so I spent a lot of time in Germany, and one of the
Yeah.
things that's so remarkable about Germany over the last 70, 80 years is how
Yes.
they have taken responsibility,
Yes.
and how they have not only said, we're sorry, but they've invested in education,
Yes.
they've had memorials, they've paid an enormous amount of restitution. My family, I personally received money
Yeah.
as a descendant of German Jews from the German government.
Yeah.
I think we can be only responsible for what we can do.
Yeah.
You know, yes, sure, you know, there are some African nations who have apologised, but Britain has done nothing. I mean, the royal family has never said sorry. They've never acknowledged. They might this week.
Yeah.
So far, they have never, and the British family, the royal family, were at the centre of British slavery. There was reparations when it came to the end of slavery, but it was the slave owners who received money. You know, in 1834, the British government had to take on the largest amount of debt it had ever taken out to compensate those who owned the slaves for losing their slaves through abolition. This debt, so John Gladstone, for example, in today's money, received over £80 million, and he bought a whole bunch of estates, and he did very well, thank you very much. According to the HMRC, the tax office, we were still paying down that debt until 2015. So you in this room, your tax money was going partly to pay off that debt, which compensated those owners of enslaved people. Just so you know, that's part of what happened. So, look, it's complicated. I don't believe in whataboutism. I don't believe just because things are complicated or there's other problems we can't
Yes.
face this. This is a particular significant historical atrocity. There's very
Yeah.
few that are really at this level, and I think we need to face up to it and do something about it.
That's true. I think Britain should apologise, but we should also remember the past. So if we remember the past, we should stop it happening in other places
Correct.
as well.
Well, this, yes, I mean,
Yeah.
slavery anywhere is
Is
obviously an
abhorrent.
evil,
Yeah.
and most places it's not legal. I think the thing that differentiates this is that it was a legal, organized, regulated,
State sanctioned.
sanctioned institution, and it went, as Thomas said, it went for hundreds of years, and people made a great deal of money. And slavery still goes on. Slavery goes all the way back, recorded human history, and probably before that. But on the level in which it was practiced, and the fact that it was so institutionalized, and the fact that it was based on race, that makes it unique. I feel, at any rate,
Yes,
I'm sure.
yes.
So thank you for that. There's I think we could talk a bit more about that, or let's just talk a little bit more about you.
Sure.
That's
Happy
the
to.
word. Because I think your own history is somewhat interesting. In my digging about online in preparation for this, I was intrigued to discover that from 2006 to 2011, you were part owner of a newspaper
Yeah.
in the States, in West Virginia, which immediately intrigued me because I know West Virginia a bit,
Oh.
and I was trying to picture you, running a newspaper, but it was in Shepherdstown, which when I found out where it was, made a bit more sense because it's just nearly a suburb of Washington,
Yes, it is.
D.C. I mean,
Yes, it
you're
is.
sort of on the edge of commuting distance. It's about the equivalent of coming from here up to London. It's about that distance. And I was, of course, picturing West Virginia, west of the Allegheny, and which is, the land of snake handling and
Wild and wonderful.
moonshining and feuds, Hatfields and McCoys.
Yeah.
Well, I met a Hatfield.
Did you?
Yeah, they exist. All that stuff happened.
Oh,
Maybe
it's
not as
real.
reported,
No,
but
it's real.
they
Sure.
there were Hatfields and there were McCoys,
Yeah, there
and
were.
they didn't like each other.
That's true.
Sorry, what are half bills?
Hatfields, they were just a family clan, you know, and then McCoys were another one, and there was feuding over, I don't even remember now exactly what it was. A lot of it gets romanticized and
Probably
and
they
exaggerated.
didn't remember either, but memory
Yeah,
is very long.
somebody, to be honest with you, places like that, sometimes just a personal slight's enough to kick things off. People are very touchy that way. But as I was saying, I was just envisioning Thomas, you know, in some place like Morgantown or
Yeah.
someplace like that, you know, running a paper, just wondering how that must have been. But Shepherdstown was obviously within, Washington D.C. was close by Baltimore. Anyway, I was wondering what that was like for you. I mean,
Yeah,
first
it was
how
wonderful.
you ended up there.
It was
'cause-
wonderful. I mean, it was. I don't know if anyone's been to West Virginia. It's the most amazing state. I highly recommend
if
it.
I'm not mistaken.
And go Mountaineers. And yeah, I was there for 10 years. And running a local newspaper was really fun, partly because there was no sophisticated media market where we lived, and so we could run stories and have a big impact with not much effort. And so we changed the Constitution of West Virginia. The Secretary of State came after us for criminal damages, and then we went after her, and it was a lot of fun. Yeah, we got a shield law, so journalists now in West Virginia they can't be forced to reveal their sources. So there was quite a lot of stuff that we could do. But we literally stopped in the street every month. It was a monthly. We stopped in the street and people would give feedback on the articles. It was
It's
great.
a small town.
It was just really, it was wonderful. Yeah, I loved it. It was really fun.
And you ended up there by
Because my wife's American and she had connections with Washington D.C. and it's very close to Washington, and we had 2 kids and we wanted to be a nice kind of more rural place to grow up. And Shepherdstown, which is, have you ever heard of Harper's Ferry? It's near Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is where John Brown had the raid on the Arsenal. He was a anti-racist and who was hung for his. He was hanged, wasn't he?
he
I
was
think?
on. Yeah, it was one of the progenitors of the American Civil War.
Definitely.
So it happened.
He's an
sometime
extraordinary
before that it
John
did.
John Brown. I mean, John Brown's body lies mouldy in the grave.
Yeah.
That's the John Brown we're talking about. Anyway, Harper's Ferry is just around the corner from us. It's where the Potomac. How do we get into this? The Potomac rivers and the Shenandoah River comes together. The Blue Ridge Mountains. Take Me Home. Country roads.
Yeah.
It's all the same place. The Blue Ridge Mountains he's talking about is where the Shenandoah and the Potomac come together at Harper's Ferry.
I've heard something about East Virginia, like pollution or something like that. Like
East Virginia, well, there's West Virginia,
Yeah.
which is a state, and then there's Virginia, which is another
oh,
state.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So-
there's definitely, I mean, Virginia is a big state. There's a lot going on there. Yeah.
West Virginia was a sort of province, territory of the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Then
when
it's
it was a
seceded,
colony. When it was a colony.
but then it's
Yeah.
just no, afterwards.
No, but I'm saying when it was a colony, then West Virginia was it's a colony.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
as a result of slavery, that's one of the reasons it seceded during the Civil War. Yeah, anyway, let's not get into
It's,
West Virginia
that's-
history.
no, it just caught my eye.
Sure.
As being a familiar
Yeah.
place to me, I was just sort
It's
of wondering
wonderful,
at that.
wonderful place to visit and live.
Of course, you bailed out of there too early, and you missed the Trump years, which
I know.
I'm sure would have.
Yeah,
Actually, I was just along those kind of lines with whether there was a book in there
about West
Okay.
Virginia.
about your experiences in West Virginia,
Yeah.
since it's.
Yeah, I've always
but
wanted to
that's
write about West Virginia. Yeah.
Okay, well we'll wait.
Yeah.
Anticipation.
I'm very fond of it.
So it's well, that brings me around to the question of where do you go from here? It's a sort of like what are you working on now? I mean,
Yeah.
given that again, a lot of your work has
Mhm.
involved a family connection or personal connection
Mhm.
and such like that. Is there still
there-
families stuff to dig out of the trunk or up in the loft?
Yeah, so the book I'm currently working on, if that's what you're asking, I'm working on 2 books. One is I did a picture book. So this is this book about the House by the Lake, which is about this house in Berlin, about the history. I did a picture book for children based on this. So I gave myself the challenge: is how do you talk about Nazis and the Stasi to 7 or 8-year-olds? That was my challenge I gave myself. And so that's what that book is. And the illustrator is the wonderful Britta Teckentrup. who's an amazing, if you know her work, German illustrator. But I'm just working on and the history they saw, and it's about the Anne Frank house. If you know the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, don't know if you've been to the Anne Frank house.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, and so the really interesting thing about the Anne Frank house is we know a lot about the 2 years that she was there, but it was there for 400 years. So what else did it see? So I'm doing a children's book about that, and then I'm doing another book about a Austrian Jewish publisher called George Weidenfeld. I don't know if you've ever heard his name. Some of you've heard his name. Yeah. Oh, really? That's interesting. Why did you say that?
Later.
Later, private conversation. George, interesting. We're going to have a conversation. George Weidenfeld, and he was the founder of this publishing house called Weidenfeld Nicholson, and whose books you probably are very familiar with. And as a way of talking about publishing, how does publishing work? How do books get made, and the books that he published. So that's the other book I'm working on.
Well, we look forward to them being out and available
Yeah.
to buy and read, and we can open up
Yeah.
for questions. I know there's already been some questions, but does anybody have any?
Sure.
I'm just wondering, thanks so much for writing all these books, they're so
It's
interesting.
my pleasure.
But what your opinion was about Mouse being banned as
Oh,
a
yeah.
book in Tennessee.
So
but-
Mouse is my favorite. I would say my favorite, if not my favorite, top 10 books of all time. So I was asked by the German Literary Festival to name my favorite book, and I'm named Mouse.
Yeah.
So does everyone know what Mouse is? Art
Said it,
Spiegelman.
Spiegelman.
It's basically it's the story of his family and their experience in the Holocaust told through mice, and he portrays the Jews as mice and the Nazis as pigs, I think, and
The
the French
cats.
cats, and then who are the pigs? The Polish are pigs,
Polish.
and the French
yes.
are dogs, I think.
God knows
Anyway,
years
if
ago.
you haven't read it, buy this book right now. Don't buy my books, buy this book. It's the most amazing book, 2 volumes. And it has been banned recently by some Texas school boards.
Tennessee, I think.
Tennessee's, is it?
Initially.
Yeah.
Is it because, do you think
We do stock it here.
it's because younger children don't have the maturity to understand the controversial subject, but then again, it's if you're banning books, it's sort of like they're not,
No, I think
not-
it's absolutely absurd, and I think
I
there's a
think-
horrible right-wing backlash going on in the States as well as this
Yes.
country as part of the cancel culture. I don't think it's got anything to do with these books. I mean, there's a question about when do you introduce serious subjects like the Holocaust to.
Yes.
That's a different
Yeah.
conversation. They're not having that conversation. There's a conversation to be had. That when should Anne Frank's diary be read by people? I think that's an interesting conversation. When should kids learn about the First World War or the Second World War? When do they learn about? And I mean, the reason why I wrote my book, this children's book, which was for 7 and 8-year-olds, is I don't talk about Nazis. I don't talk about the Stasi. I talk about angry people. I talk about people who take things from you. I talk about people who are mean and falling in love with places. And so I think children can understand things at that level. And I think we have to be careful about when we introduce things. But no, the mouse thing is absolutely ridiculous, and it's part of this really worrying, I think, conversation about the right to publish and who gets to decide, and the politicization of literature.
And that's both left and right.
Absolutely it is.
That's coming from.
Yes.
So it's not
Yes.
just saying the bad
Absolutely.
guys are in one particular part of
No.
the spectrum.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
There's,
I read the other day that
I agree.
yes, please.
I think Mouse, I mean, I read before that Mouse had been banned. I'm not quite sure where it was
Yeah.
in the States. That not because it deals with the Holocaust, but because several mice are naked and somebody says God damn.
That's
I
right.
think 6 people say God
That's
damn.
actually what it is. No, it's
And
extraordinary.
I mean, that is just astonishing. But apparently
exactly
what
what it
happened with Spiegelman is there's some bunch of people somewhere in the States decided to push out this fact, and has ended up with every copy in the States being sold
Yeah.
and distributed to children.
In-
Because it was
in-
taken off the curriculum.
I think the local independent bookshop
Yeah,
in
that's it.
Tennessee where this happened did
That's it.
crowdsourcing to raise the
Yeah.
money to buy,
Brilliant.
and they cleaned out the warehouses of every copy
Yeah.
of Mao's
It's wonderful.
there, and then distributed
great.
them. And there is the point that gets made in this that if you want to sell a book,
Yes.
have it banned.
Yeah.
And if you want the kids to read it, then ban it. And I think that's probably proved true.
I remember reading Lady Chatterley's Lover for that
Yeah,
reason.
always up to the bit that was the you know the racing.
Yeah,
My
kind
brother was the agent for Spycatcher,
Okay, there we go.
Yeah,
There we go.
and that sold rather well.
Mm.
Every airport.
But
picture.
I
I've
just
sold well. I don't know how many people read it.
just to say, like, you know, coming from the States where this sort of stuff goes on, or not having grown up in the States where this stuff tends to happen, this is a perennial thing. It crops up all the time, and it there's a bit of furore, and then it settles down a bit, and it crops up again. They've been banning To Kill a Mockingbird for years, and for the obvious reasons. And the same reason that they're banning mouse, it's not because there's a naked mouse in it. It's because of this, it is ultimately because they have trouble dealing with the
Yeah.
subject
That's right.
in these places.
I mean, are there not other books in the States that deal with the Holocaust?
Not ones that necessarily are going to be accessible to the kids
So
the way that
Toni
mouse
Morrison's
would be.
Beloved has also been banned. I mean, it's just for the
It never occurred to me that simply because it was a cartoon book, it was aimed at children.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
but
it's a crossover. I think they might say it's a crossover book. Maybe it's for both.
well, it was the one that established graphic novels,
yeah,
that we used to call comic books, as a serious
yeah.
form to
brilliant
tell a story
V for
with.
Vendetta
Before then, it
banned
was
as well, so
Pun?
V for Vendetta was banned.
That was later. Oh, you
Yeah,
has
yeah.
that been banned? I don't know.
Well, it's
What-
another comic book.
which
Yeah.
well, yeah.
I
I
don't
think
know.
there-
Some other.
there were underground comics before Mouse, which that sort of comes out of.
Mm.
But they were, as the name suggests, underground. So you didn't find them in the local corner shop, sort of thing.
I'm quite surprised because isn't this like a capitalist government and they're acting like communists? Like banning books or burning books?
Well, I don't know. Maybe communists act like capitalists.
I mean, books have been banned for a long time. You know, I mean, Lady Chatterley's Lover, or the Henry Miller books. You know, you've got all those. You've got Lolita. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, there's a lot. You've got The Group by Mary McCarthy, which was banned in Australia for having one very vague suggestion about lesbian love. You know, I mean, there's all these. Yeah.
But it, fortunately, or unfortunately, in terms of sales, none of Thomas's books have been
Not
banned.
yet.
Not yet. But we'll work
Yeah.
we'll work on it.
Maybe you can start that campaign.
Oh well, there you go. This is really,
Oh, I'm
very
sorry.
upset.
Buy this book before it's banned.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to add local interest and guilt on your
Yeah.
William Ewart Gladstone, whose maiden speech in the House of Commons in 1833 was actually supporting one of the major speakers, who was the Winchester MP, one Alexander Baring, three
Yeah.
times Member of Parliament for Winchester,
That's right.
who made this long speech about how
Yeah.
the slaves in the Caribbean were treated
Yeah.
brilliantly, and you know they could go to church now, and
Yeah.
they were fed well, and they're really well treated, unlike the peasants in this
That's
country and Europe who had a
Yeah.
much worse life, etc., etc.
So that speech is in here in this book.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean that speech is. I mean it's.
The depressing thing
gobsmacking.
is, it might
just
even
to
have
read
been
it.
true that
It
they were
wasn't true. It
treated
wasn't true.
better than the peasants.
It wasn't true.
I don't think
No,
so.
I mean, you were sexually assaulted, you were punished, your life expectancy was 5 or 6 years. No, it wasn't true.
I'm
And,
certainly not trying to say it wasn't terrible. I
I-
do think that another book can say how terribly the peasants were treated.
I'm sure there's some class analysis to
Yeah.
make sure.
The
guess-
Bishop of Winchester at the time, Brownlow North, his wife, her father was a massive mortgagee
Is that right?
of slaves.
Mm.
So Bishop Brownlow North, as well as Baring's buying Northington grain
That's
from
interesting.
slave money, Brownlow North, 20 years after his wife had died,
Yeah.
is on the list of the 1834 applicants for compensation.
So one of the interesting
for
things about the
slavery fund.
church is that they're on both sides of this. On the one side, you have the missionaries and some of the humanitarians who were very much organising for the anti-slavery campaign. But then you had,
But they were all non-conformists.
they were
And
non.
they were the bad guys, the Methodists and the
Correct.
Quakers and
You're
the thing.
exactly right.
They were
Typically-
causing trouble in the
typically
colony.
they
The
were not-
Anglicans said, we
Typically,
want.
and so you'd have
we want to be the Tory
bishops,
party
you'd
of
have
Europe.
vicars who'd actually their names were on You know, so it's really interesting. You've got this two sides. You're exactly right.
Well, the church, the established church in this country has always been part of, is the establishment as well too. So the people, the leaders of the church, of the Anglican Church, come from the same families and the same backgrounds
Yeah.
as the people that were running
The
things.
first son inherited the estate, the second one went into the army, the third into the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the second son went to Virginia or North Carolina and bought a plantation,
Yeah.
and that's a lot of. And when you actually, in America, Virginia and
Mm.
North Carolina is probably the most like this. People think Boston and such like that, but probably the most like this country you'll find is places like Virginia and North Carolina, where people's family names matter.
Was there any money in Winchester? Was there any buildings in Winchester that was built with slave compensation money or slave sugar money? Or do you know of that?
Not sure, but there is quite a lot around, and you know,
There's
the,
some
na-
grand,
the,
there's some grand.
the
Georgian
name Drummond
buildings scattered
is,
about.
is quite big on the compensation application lists.
But,
And what's
And
Drum-
you
what's
look at
Drum-
the
and what's
people who
Drummond
think
and-
they're still the lord and lady of the manor and what it's all based on.
if I could just,
All
if
right.
I could,
You're being quiet in there.
yeah, if I could just,
Yes, it is.
if I could just interject here, which goes back to the thing about people being mistreated and having a rough time of things in life and peasantry and such like that. If I could just go back to the fact that in this case, what we're talking about is a race thing as well too. That the reason these people were enslaved was because they were black, and the reason it was allowed to go on is because they looked different than we do. And if they had found a population of white people somewhere that they could, like the Caucasians or something like Caucasus Mountains, I mean, I don't know if it would have worked that way.
I feel you're getting the wrong way around. They
Mhm.
wanted to justify continuing slavery, and that's the obvious hook to hang your justification on. I don't think that. I think the reason why white people consider themselves superior to black people was because it was necessary to justify treating them that way.
No, unfortunately, it's the exact opposite. I mean, in the 1770s, the 1600s, the British colonialists in the United States came up with these rules about race difference and about superiority, and it was an economic imperative. It was totally an economic imperative, so that they could have this free labor force. And up till then, there hadn't been a sense of difference institutionalized in terms of law. And then these rules from Virginia were then spread around North America and then around the Caribbean. And that was the kind of the scaffolding with which they built the entire slave society. So, I mean, it was very much part. I mean, this is what the legacy is today. That's why people who are descended from African enslavement say that is the legacy. It's not just the economic outcomes and the cultural outcomes. It's also the sense of racism and prejudice that's come down the
They
generations.
are still living this till today. I mean,
Yeah.
in the States, the blacks are treated entirely differently. Like
Well-
the fear and, I mean, the police. Like
It's also who's considered black as well too, which brings this to mind. I mean, it's also, I mean, historically, you have someone like Northrop, 12 years a slave. He was a free man in the North. He was basically kidnapped, brought to the South, and because of his race, he was a slave. That was it. Didn't matter that legally he was a free man at home in the South, because he was of African descent. He could be chattel. He could be owned. In America, most African Americans who can trace their lineage back to slavery days, most of them, a great many, are mixed race. And it's really evident when you see, you go to Africa someplace like that, you can see the difference. And someone like Barack Obama, whose father was African, his mother was white. In America, he's identified as black. So he's not identified as white. Why not be white? Because his mother was white. But he's identified as black because his father is black and he has certain features. And he identifies himself that way as well too. For if you read his books, there's reasons for that. But just as a famous example, so if you have certain features and a certain cast of skin, then you are seen differently. and again, just to come back to it, I'm sorry, so I don't want to rant. I'll leave that. I'll leave that for others. But it's just to make that comparison. I mean, my mother's side of the family came from southern Italy, in Mezzagonia, and they came to America for a better life. And then my grandmother came from from Basilicata, if you think of when Christ stopped at Eboli, and came from a very poor part of Italy. But she came to America, and and her children did well enough, and all this so forth like that, and so she was basically peasant background. She could read and write, which is a bit of cut above a lot of people that she grew up with, but it's not the same thing as that she treated in America whatever prejudice she felt was nothing compared to if she had been of African descent. Sorry, I'll stop there. Sorry, Thomas. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I were there other questions? Anybody have?
I'd like a slightly different one.
Go
There's
for it.
two sides of your family.
Yeah.
You've got the persecuted on one side and the persecuted on the other. What
Yeah.
was the family conversation like?
Yes, it was really interesting. So I reached out to people. I started my research before George Floyd was murdered, but I reached out to my family after, mostly, and the response was overwhelmingly of interest. I spoke to 80 people in my family. We've got a very broad family. I mean, partly because I've done this book, so I kind of reached out to them. And I didn't know this side of my family. I'm much closer to my dad's side of my family than my mother's side of my family. So a lot of them were new to me. And there were some, mostly elderly, but not all, who were very resistant. How dare you? You're going to damage our reputation. This thing happened 200 years ago. There's other issues we need to focus on. Other people did it. There's endless amounts of justifications. And so of the 80, maybe 3 or 4, and they were angry. There was some anger there. They would call me up and chew me out. But for the most part, people were really interested. And then we started having family meetings. So we'd have these Zoom, it was during the kind of lockdown, we'd have these Zoom calls where there'd be 30 people on the call. And the first thing was just becoming aware of this history. And then it was like, okay, we're going to acknowledge it. This is something that we have benefited from. That was a really big thing to get to, just that. This is something that we have benefited from. And just holding that. Because there's a lot of people in my family who are very, they're very can-do, and they want, okay, let's do something, let's do it. But before we even got to that, it was like, let's just hold that for a minute. And then there was conversations about, well, is there anything we want to do? And are there some projects we can get hold of? And so that was a whole different conversation. And then we reached out to some Black British organizations, and we said to them, look, we're interested in maybe doing something. Is there anything you think which might be appropriate? And so we got some feedback, and one of the things that was suggested was to support a PhD position. And so that's what we've done. We've supported a PhD position for a young Black British person of Caribbean descent who's going to focus on British slavery. And it's a very modest thing, it's not something I want to dwell on too much because that's not the point of the story, but the conversation was really interesting, in terms of the family dynamic, and then talking to other families who are having similar conversations. I think this conversation, in the States, I think it's more progressed. I think this conversation's been going on for longer. I think in this country it's happening. It's definitely happening, where families are beginning to look into their past and they're saying, okay, what was our role? What was our position? And even people who recently come to this country, they may not have been around in the 19th century. There's acknowledgement that white people have still benefited from the advantages, the wealth.
I have to say, I was actually thinking about the Lions side and the Spacco side, and the German side, where they were dispossessed. So those whites, obviously, in that instance, were dispossessed, but that was for
So they're both my family, right? So
that's right. So I wondered what happened around your own supper table at home.
So there's, I think that,
Did it take you to bring it all
I
out?
think that it has helped inform the conversation. So certainly when I was in Guyana, when I said my family were German Jewish, it definitely made the conversation easier, without doubt. I think there was some sympathy, some ideas, some shared, and look, we can't compare and contrast atrocities. I think that's a mistake, But there are some lessons to be learned, and it certainly made people, I think, more open to me coming there and asking questions. And one of the things people kept saying to me was like, well, the Jewish people, they received reparations. Why with what happened to the Holocaust, why don't we? And I think that's entirely valid, I have to say.
Not an easy question to answer.
Yeah.
Question.
It's not an easy question to answer. I was just responding to what Thomas was saying. I do know in the States during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s that there was a lot of involvement from the North, young people of Jewish descent, quite famously.
Yeah.
Some were lost their lives.
Yeah. South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, a lot of.
Again, so there was a thing. I think there was a sort of, at least in those times, a sort of
crossover,
a bit of a fit.
Or an ally. There's an allyship.
Yeah, I think there was an understanding of this. You know, we can relate to that. Anyway, I don't want to get started again because it went off on one before. Yes, another question.
It's not really a question, but it's a thing I recommend that you see the documentary 500 Years Later, if you haven't seen it, all about slavery, and so it's quite interesting about.
That was on the television, was it?
Yeah, it's a documentary. Get it off Amazon. It's all about.
There are other places to access these things, and hopefully ones that pay taxes and don't treat their employees like rubbish.
Yes.
I just felt that it's necessary to put that in. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if there's anything further we can say. Thomas is.
I've got lots more questions.
You
but
do?
I'm keeping them down.
Oh, okay, well, that's fine. I mean, this is a subject, obviously, and this is a little bit different than the normal sort of evening that happens when I have authors in and things like that. But it is a subject that obviously engenders different points of views and feelings. And as I said before, it's interesting to see the recent focus on this kind of stuff, what it's provoking among people, and there's discourse going on. Some of it is more temperate than others. But otherwise, I think Thomas is quite nice to stick around for a while. He'll sign books if anybody wants to buy any of his books. We'd be happy to sell you one, and then Thomas will inscribe something in it for you. And so we'll end there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Thomas.